Okay, so welcome everyone to today's webinar with Michael Nagler. He's going to be giving us a presentation based on the TED Talk that he recently gave in Fremont, California. So thank you all so much for coming today and taking time out of your day to join us. And I will go ahead and pass it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Stephanie. And greetings, everyone. I usually would say good morning, but it might not be appropriate given where you may be. And I think you all know that I will be traveling for 2 weeks to Italy and then to Israel, so I won't be able to do office hours with you for a couple of weeks now. So, and if you have other questions when we're finished with the ones that are directly related to the roadmap, to the webinar, you should feel free to ask them also toward the end. So I was, as Stephanie was saying, I was invited to give a TEDx talk in Fremont a week or so ago, and it was very challenging to pack all my ideas into 18 minutes, but I found it a very helpful process. And I've had a couple of thoughts working with the material that I think really pull things into focus for all of us as we have to communicate with people where we think we're at with the process of changing to a nonviolent future. This little fawn that you see on the screen was born outside my window about the time that I was getting this talk together. And I tried very hard to think of a way of making it relevant, and I couldn't do that. But on the emotional level, it was very relevant. It put me into a wonderful mood to give the talk, and I hope it'll put you into a very good mood to receive it. I started the talk, and I'll start it now with a story that was told to me by my friend Mubarak Awad, who established the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence in Ramallah, which is a city in the West Bank, or as they call it, occupied Palestine. A teenage boy, one of what they call in Arabic the shabab, the male youth, came limping into his office one day with a complaint. And he had gone to a street corner in Ramallah where he knew that an Israeli patrol would pass by at a certain time. And he had thrown a rock at the Jeep and hit a soldier, and the soldier jumped out of the Jeep and chased him down and beat him up rather badly. But that isn't what the young man was complaining about, because in fact, badly hurt as he was, he went there the second day and did the same thing and managed to hit the Jeep again. The same soldier vaulted out of the Jeep and chased him down and beat him up. He went back, but that still isn't what he was complaining about. On the third day, he went back and managed to do the same thing. And the soldier chased him, it probably wasn't very difficult, and caught him and gave him a big hug. And so this teenage boy was saying to my friend Mubarak, "Why did he hug me?" He wasn't expecting that response. And Mubarak said, "Because he's human." So we have in the story people reacting off one another in a partly nonviolent spirit, because throwing a stone in this case is more a sign of defiance than and the ability to actually injure anyone. The courage, the willingness to suffer, these are all elements of nonviolence. And Mubarak's answer, which was perfect, he did that because he's human, reminded me of a conversation between a Kurdish activist in Iraqi Kurdistan and a member of Christian peacemaker teams. This is one of these groups that carries out what's called unarmed civilian peacekeeping. And this Kurdish activist had said to the man from CPT that he's going to adopt nonviolence for a major struggle. The person from CPT said, "You can certainly do that. That's a very good idea, but you should know that nonviolence is very difficult," which is true. Requires a lot of preparation, which is also true. It takes longer, which turns out not to be true. All of these things. And the Kurdish gentleman said, "I know that it's difficult, you need training, you have to strategize, it takes longer. But he said, at least you don't lose your humanity in the process. And right at the time that he was making that remark, thousands of American servicemen and women had committed suicide in Iraq and Afghanistan. By 3 years ago, we passed the point where more of service people kill themselves than are being killed by the enemy. And they're doing it precisely because they lost their humanity in the process, or they thought that they lost their humanity in the process of using all of that violence. And as one of them said to a filmmaker friend of mine, I lost my soul in Iraq. So I think we're seeing that nonviolence has something quite essential to do with who we are as human beings. And the practice of nonviolence not only helps the person to whom it is offered, even though it may get them to give up something wrong that they were doing, but it's very, very helpful to the person offering it. It couldn't be more helpful. You're actually realizing yourself as a human being. So speaking of unarmed civilian peacekeeping, I want to show you a picture of these two fine young men, Derek Oakley from the UK and Andres Gutierrez from Latin America, who are with Nonviolent Peace Force in a desperate UN-organized internal displaced person camp in one of the most violent places in the world, the state of Jonglei in South Sudan. And we might look at this picture and ask ourselves, why are these men smiling? Well, three levels I'm going to try to answer that question on. One level is they're smiling because they just saved the lives of 14 people. There was a vicious attack on this camp. It ended up actually 58 people were killed in the attack by the time it was over. Derek and Andres went and took shelter, unquote, in a mud hut where they discovered 4 women and 9 children huddling there. And in a minute, the militia burst in with AK-47s and axes and sticks and saw these 2 men who were obviously not Sudanese and said to them, get out, with the obvious intention of killing the women and children. Derek and Andres were well trained. They had spent a lot of time building up their team. They glanced at one another. They knew exactly what to do. They turned and looked at the militia, looked them in the eye and said, we're not leaving. And they were threatened 3 times. 3 times they refused to leave. And finally the militia pulled out. So on one level they were very happy because they risked their lives to save innocent women and children, and it worked. On another level, you could say they're smiling because they're showing us a way out of war. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping is one of those institutions that is going to enable us to build a form of protection that will not require us to face this horrific choice between doing nothing or using military force when people are under threat. But I would add even a third level, and that is that they're very happy because they have done something to raise the human image. If a human being can dedicate part of his life, take training, and go to the most dangerous place in the world and risk their lives for others with whom they have no connection, they're not relatives, they're not even members of the same race, and that it can work, they have done something to show something essential about a human being. And if there ever was a time where we needed a better image of a human being, this was it. And this one advertisement stands for many, many thousands. You see a picture of a handsome dude with a grim kind of action movie expression on his face, driving a slick red sports car at high speed across the desert. And the wonderful thing is that the beats per minute of his heart precisely match the RPM of the engine. And if that wasn't clear enough, you have the actual message: don't just drive the car, be the car. So please don't think that this is just a one-off. Remember that we are exposed to between 3,000 and 5,000 of these commercial messages every day. And underneath the text of those commercial messages, here the text is, buy this particular brand of car, which didn't work for me. I don't even remember what brand it is. But underneath that, there's the message that you are empty, that you can only be fulfilled by purchasing a machine, and that there's no purpose to life other than having sensations, and that eventually we have built into our minds the picture that we ourselves are things. And that's why the great practitioners of nonviolence, one of the things that they all have in common was to resist this image that we are things. And one of the brilliant things that Martin Luther King said, among many others, is we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented civilization to a person-oriented civilization. Now, this very degraded image of who we are as separate material objects doomed to compete for scarce resources has led to a lot of violence, and it is part of a larger picture which embraces the whole of reality, really, and gives us a worldview or an image of what we think reality is. Now, it's not good form to read a quote while you are seeing it on the screen, so let me just give you a minute to read this quote from Thomas Berry, who was an important leader in this field of bringing in a new story. The only alteration I would make is that I think we really need to think not just about survival needs, but about breakthrough needs, about breaking through to a new, higher level of human life, because I don't think survival alone is going to make it. Here's a simpler expression from a journalist recently: we are only as brave as the stories that we tell ourselves. So the question in the minds of many of us is we have to shed this old story that began with the Industrial Revolution, that the world is an inert object and everything is based on material particles that are colliding with one another in a random universe. We have to get rid of that story, and we have to find a new story. But where are we going to find one? And whenever I ask myself this question, I seem to hear voices saying, hello, you know, we've been trying to tell you this for 5,000 years. And these are the voices of the great men and women who constitute what we call now the wisdom tradition. Partly indigenous people, partly saints and sages from the great religions, East and West. And here's one quote, an anonymous quote from the Cloud of Unknowing, which is a 14th century document. Let me again let you read it and then make a quick comment and move on. What I want to point out is that the beauty of the universe, its splendor, unimaginable complexity, but unity underneath, is external to us as a human being, and for that reason it is beneath us in, what shall we say, ontological value, or what this anonymous author, a Carthusian monk of central England, called our exalted dignity. And this is, of course, not just something from the West. In the Bhagavad Gita, there is a beautiful image that the human being is like a mirror in which the beauty and the splendor of all reality is reflected, except that that mirror has been covered over by dust, a thick layer of dust. So the question is not where can we find a new story. The story is there. In fact, it's older than what we're calling the old story. Never mind that. But rather how, there's a twofold challenge I think we're faced with. How do we adapt this story, which often is in language that we can't easily relate to modern conditions? And then how do we get people to believe it? In other words, how do we adapt it and how do we adopt it? Because that latter is not an obvious thing. Just to hear a story that can be corroborated, that can be proven, it doesn't necessarily change people's minds. For example, when the old story began in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there's no record of any meeting of any society that decided from now on we shall regard the planet not as a living being, not as our mother, but as an inert object, so it'll be more convenient for us to do the mining and that was even before mountaintop removal and fracking and the horrible things that we're doing to poison and destroy the earth. We shifted from a worldview where that was impossible to a worldview where that was possible, but nobody knows exactly how that was done, and it's not clear exactly how we're going to both adapt and adopt the story that we need now, this adaptation of the ancient story. But it happens that there have been two really major developments that have taken place in about the last 30 or 40 years, which give us exactly the two tools that we need to adapt the eternal story to modern times and adopt it. And those two developments are the tremendous revolution in science, which is the shift from what scientists themselves call classical science to new science. And that's for the adapting part. For the adopting part has been the tremendous rise of nonviolence. So we might ask ourselves, given the fact that violence is harmful for the perpetrator and harmful for the victim, and nonviolence is elevating, fulfilling for the perpetrator, and elevating for the person to whom it's offered, why are we stuck with this violence and its embeddedness in the old story of materialism and so forth? And Gandhi had a kind of answer to that question. He said, new ideas or old ideas in a new form are bound to create consternation and what we call cognitive dissonance. And nonviolence is a very, very old idea. And I'm going to launch now into a brief discussion with you of the science part of the story, and then we'll look at the nonviolence part of the story. Give you a minute to read this. I think what I should have done is actually covered up the name of the person who said this and asked you, who do you think said that? And most of you would say the Buddha or Teresa of Avila or some great mystic, and you'd be startled to see that it was said by the person who discovered the quantum nature of reality. Stephanie, if you're trying to send me a message, would you please try my phone because I can't change the screen right now. So there are two tremendous changes that come in about the beginning of the 20th century with the discovery of the quantum nature of reality. One is non-materiality, that things are not little blue balls or yellow balls that I was still taught 50, 100 years later in high school, but shifts of energy, which they call quantum jumps, and secondly, that the quantum jump is intrinsically a shift of the entire universe. In other words, that the universe is non-local. The fact that I'm speaking here is actually in some mysterious way involved with the process that's going on in some distant galaxy. And this can be proven, although it cannot be understood. So after about 45 or 50 years, there was a shift in the life sciences as well. And I want to just tell you about two experiments that are part of the new science of nature and human nature. One was done by Frans de Waal, who is a great animal behaviorist, who did this experiment. He took these rhesus monkeys, which I'm calling them bad primates. They're very aggressive animals, and he put in with them a group of, here's another one. Recognize this guy from the subway back in New York. So rhesus are kind of nasty characters, and he put in a group of stump-tailed monkeys who are good primates. As you can see, they're much, much less aggressive. They wanted to see which group would overwhelm, or how long it would take for the violence of the rhesus to overwhelm the stump-tails. And to their amazement, it was the culture of the stump-tails that actually prevailed over the culture of the rhesus monkeys. Not only did the stump-tails stand their ground, refuse to move but refuse to fight back and prevail, but after a short period of time, the rhesus monkeys actually started adopting what we might call proto-nonviolent behaviors of the stump-tails. So that's two surprises. The third surprise came when they pulled the stump-tail colony out and waited to see how long it would take for the rhesus to go back to their old ways. They didn't. So what we saw from this experiment was that deep in our evolutionary inheritance, there are patterns of nonviolence which are powerful, which can shift cultures, and which are robust when they have come into place. Now, I have time only to tell you about one experiment on the human level, and that is that it's a fact that if you're sitting here looking at this computer screen, and up on that screen comes a picture of someone from a different race, a very, very deep structure in your brain, in the reptilian brain, called the amygdala, will fire up, go into action, and will cause you to have a fight or flight response. At least it's going to try to cause you to have that response. And so two researchers at Princeton University, Mary Wheeler and Susan Fisk, were very unhappy with this and wanted to show that it isn't necessarily the case. And they showed that if you just sit in front of that picture and say to yourself, if you're the subject and the researcher asks you, does this person like crunchy peanut butter or smooth peanut butter, that amygdala reaction will not take place. So your change of mindset reprograms your brain, not the other way around. And in this case, what you're doing is seeing that person as a human being and not as a member of a category. So let's move on now to a tremendous representative of nonviolence who was also profoundly scientific in his outlook. This is a famous picture of Gandhi absorbed in meditation, and it was on the strength of that, the power of that practice, that he was able to pick up a handful of salt in 1930 April on the beach at Dandin and bring down the greatest empire the world had ever seen without firing a shot. It also made it possible for him to win over enemies in an absolutely incredible way. This was shown him with these women who were the Lancashire mill workers whom he had put out of work by his cloth boycott. But after speaking with them for a short time, They said, "Ip ip orai." So you're probably aware, or you'll be becoming aware in this course, that in the last 30 or 40 years there's been a tremendous rise of nonviolence, both quantitatively. There's probably something like 2/3 of the world now has experienced a major nonviolent uprising of some kind. And qualitatively, we've got this new institution that I mentioned earlier, unarmed civilian peacekeeping, and several other institutions. We've started to learn how to take out the best practices of nonviolence and communicate that to others. We'll be doing that at a couple of parts of the world next week that for various reasons I don't want to mention. The fact is that while science adapts and corroborates the new story that we need so badly, nonviolence brings it to life. Nonviolence shows the fact that people are capable of offering it, and the fact that people are reliably capable of responding to it shows that the eternal story of human dignity and the embeddedness of that story in a new picture of human nature are true. So the new science, if we learn how to use it, will enable us to understand the story that we need, and nonviolence will enable us or induce us to adopt it. But okay, you and I are not Gandhi. Here's Antoinette Tuff showing that an ordinary human being with some spiritual foundations was able to deflect a would have been horrific act of violence. You're probably aware that in Decatur, Georgia, a young man went into a school with very heavy weapons, and she just stepped in front of him and said, "You know, you have problems, we have problems, we all have problems, but you're a good person, I love you, and I think you should put your weapons on the table now and lie down on the floor." Just talked him out of it. And a lot of us here in the States anyway read about this in the mass media, but what we didn't read was the analysis of the story, the realization that we had two security systems available that day. One was the official security system consisting of a steel gate, barrier, and police, both of which failed. The barrier failed. The police were actually making matters worse. The other security system was a human being, and that succeeded. But we don't have any culture, any education in place to help us learn how to be effective nonviolent practitioners in situations like this, which hopefully most of us we will never meet, or in other situations. And that, of course, is why Metta has developed the roadmap, which you are familiar with or are becoming familiar with. And so I won't take the time to go into the whole scheme now. It's a completely Gandhian model, but what I would like to do is take a close look at that person power in our now person-oriented civilization, as MLK said. And here are 5 tips that any of us can follow without necessarily volunteering to go to the Sudan or being a Gandhi or being caught in a horrific situation. We can avoid the mass media, which is usually not a popular thing to hear about, and we can fill our consciousness with nonviolence, which is the realization of the opposite story from what the mass media are telling us. We can take up a spiritual practice, and we can maybe help you find a meditation practice if you haven't got one yet. Just take the trouble to act personally with everyone that you encounter. I mean, part of what our civilization is trying to do to us is to turn us into machines and isolate us, to deny our consciousness and our unity. And if we do something simple, like I used to drive across a particular bridge every Tuesday afternoon with a friend, and they had people collecting your tolls at that time. He would give money to the toll collector And he would say, hello, how are you today? My name is George, and my friend Michael and I are going blah, blah. And I'm sitting there and saying, George, what the heck are you doing? Let's get out of here before the traffic is building up. But then I realized that he was doing the right thing. He was going about it in a personal, human, nonviolent way. That's something that we can practice, especially if we have those first 3 points behind us. It will make us much more effective. Finally, and most importantly, whenever we get a chance, when we've chosen our issue and we're working on it and we run into resistance from people when they ask us, why do you care about saving the whales, or why do you care about saving people in Guatemala, tell the story. Remind them that the old model where matter gives rise to energy and that somehow there's consciousness in the universe, they're right about these 3 levels, but they're absolutely wrong about the priority. There, I've done it. I just changed from the old story to the new eternal story before our very eyes. It's exactly the other way around. Consciousness creates energy, creates matter. And we can run this again as in the microcosm of the human being. Because the old story was when the limbic system, when the amygdala fires off, we get mad. The new story is when we see a person as a human being, we direct the limbic system, the amygdaloid nucleus, to shut up. Resorting now to that inexhaustible supply of deepest wisdom, bumper stickers. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience, which many people in California think. We are actually spiritual beings having a human experience. So remember that we are all part of one another. Remember that we are free, conscious agents with responsibility. Remember that we have infinite resources within us so that we do not have to exploit the planet for our fulfillment. And remember, above all, that we're capable of giving and receiving nonviolence. I think just these 4 points being articulate about them, if we keep on using them whenever we interact with people, it will prepare a tipping point to change over to the new story. So I just wanted to end by sharing with you that the day after Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated, in other words, February 1st, 1948, the entire nation of India was plunged into an indescribable grief. And there was one journalist who was bewildered. He had never been in such a situation with such devastating emotional power. And he said to an Indian friend of his, would you please tell me what is going on here? And the Indian friend said, well, the people believed that there was a mirror in the Mahatma in which they saw reflected the greatest that they were capable of. And now they are afraid that that mirror has been shattered. So I think the story that I've been trying to share with you, friends, is that the mirror has not been shattered. It can never be shattered. But we have let it get covered over with quite a bit of dust. And I hope that we will all feel inspired to join into the process of blowing away the dust and seeing ourselves as we really are. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm going to thank you in advance even more for your feedback. These are very important ideas to us at the Metta Center right now, and I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie to feed me your questions or comments.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael. I think there was probably a round of applause in the virtual world happening at the end of that presentation. And
virtual namaste.
And we do have a question from Anna. So Anna's asking, at my presentation, which Anna recently gave a presentation on the roadmap for the Metta Center, one person from the audience asked, though he agreed with the importance of the news story, he also felt the systems and institutions in our society are so powerful. He asked how the power of consciousness can counter those institutions, and how would we or you respond?
Yeah, the question itself kind of arises from the old story, does it not? Because the old story says that institutions, structures, and corporations and physical might have all the power, and consciousness is some kind of flimsy thing. So that in itself is part of the old paradigm, which we're trying to shed. But that doesn't quite answer your question, Anna. The question is, how do we convince them? And I think, depending on the person that we're speaking to, one of the ways that we can convince them is by showing historically how changes in consciousness have led to amazing and rapid changes. So many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was working with a socialist friend of mine on Berkeley campus, and I asked him approximately the same question. There's such a juggernaut out there of wrong institutions, and that was, not nearly as bad as it is now. How is all of this going to change? And because he had followed, Russian history, he said, well, look, up until a particular date, I don't remember which day it was, Joseph Stalin was regarded as God. There were statues of him in every town in Great Russia. And one day later, when the word came out that he was to be downgraded and made into a non-person, it was all over. The statues were down, the conversations were completely different. So these tremendous shifts are possible only in consciousness, really. And I think what we now realize, we being the people who have been thinking about how to make this shift happen, what we now realize is that whereas in the past these great shifts have taken place more or less automatically, in today's world we have to intervene consciously. We have to make them take place ourselves. And so that's why I emphasize the value of learning the news story and using it. I know there's a story about a man who was a very successful businessman, and he attracted the attention of one of the Rockefellers, and this person tried to get this guy to join him in a scheme, a really malicious scheme to basically be an economic hitman. And the first person, successful businessman, said he wouldn't go along with it. And so Nick Rockefeller asked him, why do you care about those people? They were going to destroy the economy of some Central American country so they could make a killing. Why do you care about these people? And I guess the businessman had really nothing to say, but suppose he had been able to say, I care about them because we're all part of one another. And science has shown that I cannot injure another person without injuring myself. Have you heard of mirror neurons? Have you heard of perpetration-induced traumatic stress? And so if we had at our back an articulate version of the new story and used it on occasions like that, or any other occasion like this one, I think it's only a matter of time, because one thing that we know about tipping points is that you build up and it doesn't seem as if anything is happening, and then when you reach a critical point, things shift and you think, oh my gosh, where did that come from? But it really has been coming all along from these little acts that every one of us can engage in. So Anna, I hope you could take what I just said and reduce it to a minimum and use that as an answer for that question, because we're going to get that question a lot. That's very understandable.
Definitely. And we have another question from Michael Whiting. Michael says, excellent talk. Does the same energy devoted to being quote-unquote secure translate easily or equally into the desire for selfless cooperation, or is there a trade-off invoked?
I do believe that it is the same energy, and it comes from the realization that entering into relationships of trust and service, selfless activity, is how people become secure. And there are 1,001 stories in the history of nonviolence that illustrate this. And it also is something that every one of us, in one way or another, has experienced. So there's a technique that we practice in spiritual practice called fake it till you make it. You may not have quite confidence that by putting down weapons and going to a person in a spirit of trust and service that you will reach that person and be more secure, but you try it anyway, even though you don't, you're saying to yourself, whoa, I hope it works. And by golly, it works. And so you build up your faith and your confidence, and you build up your awareness of that inner resource within you. And I think the kind of security that you get from within is far superior to these hopeless attempts to get security from without. So in short, Michael, I think it's the same energy, that you're taking it from a place where it cannot possibly give you what it wants, it cannot possibly succeed, and you're using it in a place where it can succeed. But it requires trust on our part in order to try it. There's going to be failures, and we'll just try to learn from both the successes and the failures. That's how human beings go about living.
We have a question from Renata. She says, a little over a year ago, there was a series of demonstrations all over Brazil. People complained about basically everything, but did not make any concrete demands. Many scholars, usually from a European background, are trying to explain what happened, comparing it with Occupy Wall Street, Spain's Los Indignados, and the Arab Spring. They stress all these movements are spontaneous and rely heavily on networks and modern communication, the internet. However, nonviolent activists and theorists tell us about the need for training. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are those of the nonviolent activists, Renata. I think we need training, and we also need organizing, and we also need a strategy. And that's what Roadmap is attempting to provide, at least provide a framework for developing those very things. And we designed Roadmap, first of all, because of Paul Hawken's discovery that there are millions of good efforts going on around the world, but there's no one movement. And so we were asking ourselves, how can we be a single movement without sacrificing our diversity? And then we had an added reason for doing it after Occupy, because in all of these movements, Arab Spring, Los Indignados, and Occupy, the Green Revolution in Iran, and so forth, they arise spontaneously, and they are characterized, what we say in the nonviolence world, characterized by the effervescence of the crowd. That, somehow a crowd phenomenon of saying, no, I will not take this, arises. What we need is a way to harness that energy. And part of that actually has happened with Occupy. They have set up a number of constructive program projects to carry on and capture that energy and make it more nonviolent and more continuous, more enduring. So I think we should prepare for new uprisings like this and have the structures in place to do the training and the organizing and putting us on a strategy. I recently learned that sometimes these movements, which seem like spontaneous uprisings, are really the result of a lot of preparation. For example, the plebiscite, which finally led to the turning out of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. Even I, who am, so-called nonviolent scholar, I thought, well, they had this opportunity and they rose to it. And I found out indirectly from a friend, Kenneth Budigan of Pache Beni, I found out that 5 years before that happened, people started meeting in their living rooms and their basements and saying, we've got to train ourselves to get rid of this man. So there actually was 5 years of training in the background. That's one of the reasons that was a successful uprising. Now in Brazil you have the landless workers movement, and it should have been helpful. I've often thought that the MST was a great example of constructive program without obstructive program. It was probably the best example of constructive program that I know of, but they had no way of dealing with attacks by the paramilitaries, etc. So that says to me, if we could bring about this marvelous combination of long-term, non-confrontational, undramatic, constructive work with the ability to resist through courageous nonviolence when needed, that would be a winning combination. I think nobody would be able to stop such a movement.
And we have a question from Monica. Renata says, thanks, Michael, for your answer to that question. And Monica's asking, is human dignity compatible with consciousness?
I believe, actually, that human dignity arises from our consciousness. It doesn't arise from our physical existence, though it is very beautiful and very dignified, and it's as a result of 5 million years or more of evolution. Still, I think our dignity comes from our consciousness, because with my body I have only this limited sphere of influence, but with our consciousness we can be having this conversation on the conscious level, and then on deeper levels than that, I know that in deep states of prayer and meditation we can contact one another. That also has been demonstrated scientifically. And so the sphere of our being expands the more we are able to shift our attention and our awareness from our physical being to our emotional being to our higher consciousness. So, yeah, Monica, I hope that answers, that was what your question was getting at. But I think really it's the unlimited nature of our consciousness that gives it and us our ultimate dignity.
So Monica added that many argue that dignity originates in reason.
Well, I think those many are mostly Westerners and people who have been educated or influenced by Westerners, because it is the case that the part of the new story that was brought in the Industrial Revolution came from Descartes. And Descartes, he believed that reason was our highest faculty, and it's the only thing that's higher than our appetite and our physical being. And I don't dispute that, but I add that we have intuitive faculties that are even higher. And I'd like to read you a marvelous description by an Indian teacher who was a contemporary of Gandhi's. He actually came to the U.S. in the 1950s, and you may be familiar with this if you ever got our old nonviolence packet or saw the new story on our website. Here he says, he's going to refer to the human being as man, and for convenience I'll just keep that up, but take man to mean man or woman, the human being. On the physical plane, man is but an animal. On the intellectual plane, which you were speaking about, Monica, he or she is a rational being. But there's two steps beyond that. On the moral plane, he or she is a power for good. On the spiritual plane, he or she is a radiant being, full of divine light, love, and bliss. Humanity's ascent from one plane to another is its natural movement.
And Monica added, yes, they are Westerners, especially in academia. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
We have a question from Carol. How essential to the process is citizenship education? The Citizenship Education Project offered workshops throughout the South during the Civil Rights Movement, teaching literacy, voting rights, and how to become active in a democratic society. Isn't this missing here today and in many countries?
You know, that's interesting, Carol. When you bring that up, I think of Gandhi's kind of ambivalent relationship to nationalism. And I think what he felt was that nationalism was a stage. And if people are sub-national, so to speak, if they haven't reached that stage yet, you have to get them to that stage. But you better be sure that that momentum doesn't stop there and that they can move beyond that stage. And that's why he developed this model, which he called the oceanic circle. You know, this old Greek myth that the world was surrounded by a body of water that they called ocean, okeanos. And he said the individual serves the family serves the village serves the district serves the state serves the nation, and the nation serves the world. That we should have a conduit for what he called the svadeshi, or unfolding of our inner potential, that takes us all the way to the experiment of human being on Earth, and shouldn't stop at national borders. But Indians had been told that they didn't have a country, just as Palestinians today are being told they don't have a country, and African Americans were being told that they don't participate in this country. It's not theirs. So in all of those cases, it was essential for them to move from what I'm calling the subnational to the national level. But critically important would be then not to stop there and say my country right or wrong, and we're numero uno, and we are the indispensable nation, and we're the exception to moral rules, and so forth. So I would say it's quite important if you're not there yet, and can be quite a stumbling block if you don't move past it.
Great. And we have a question from John, who's one of the graduates of the pilot program for the certificate program. And John is asking, one of the 5 trainings in Roadmap is to avoid mass media. As a side note, in the current certificate program, we just did the section on media just 2 weeks ago. Do you see any value in also reading a mass media source such as MSNBC to have an understanding of how some current events are being presented to the public? Or do you think it is best to avoid such sources altogether?
Well, that is probably the most common question that we receive. And, you know, the reality is I read the local paper every morning for about 5 minutes. So I can't say that avoidance means total avoidance, but I do remember watching my spiritual teacher, Sri Ishwaran, read the paper. Now, he read 2 or 3 papers every day, John, for precisely the reason that you were bringing up. He wanted to know what was going on in the world, and he knew that through the paper, not in the paper, but through the paper, he could find out about things that were going on in the world. But when he saw a headline that was designed to catch your prurient interest or give you the sensation that by reveling in somebody else's misbehavior, you would feel better about yourself, he just plain didn't read that article. So that message did not go in to him. So in the end, this becomes a personal matter. And I do this too, I see a headline, and one eye is looking inside, on my mind and my emotions and saying, oh, what's going on here? And if I get, oh boy, let's read about this murder, I don't read it. But if I say, well, maybe I can learn something from this and use it for my next op-ed, I will hold my nose and read it. So I think that for any of us, the total volume of the consumption of mass media should really shrink. And then, so that's the quantitative aspect. The qualitative aspect is we should just monitor our own responses carefully and expose ourselves only where it isn't going to do us any harm. And when we do that, I think we will be doing the most responsible thing in the universe. We will be taking care of our own consciousness, which is the one that we've been given to take care of. So again, I'm sorry, John, that was a kind of long-winded answer, but it becomes a sort of subtle question, and I think it deserves some thought. And we each have to work out our personal equation for it.
Okay, so we have three more questions, it looks like. Let's start with Michael. So Michael Whiting's asking, as the father of 4 beautiful children, I believe that this nonviolent science from Metta and others is a springboard to fertile imagination. Do you see the new story being exemplified in the young people around you, and how?
I see it being exemplified much more in the young people than in the grown-up people. And I remember having a conversation with an educator friend of mine many years ago who described her frustration of seeing these beautiful young children come into schools full of eagerness and creativity, and in the course of the 8 years of education, that eagerness and creativity was drained out of them. So in the new world, which we're going to arrive at after the Great Turning, we're going to have to completely reorganize and reground the educational system so that it captures and allows to develop the creativity and the spontaneity of children. And I know one model for this system would be Montessori education. Maria Montessori was very close to Gandhi, and she designed an education for that purpose, and it's not the only one, but it's the most effective one that I know of. And I think that it's critically important, and we can, of course, the main responsibility for this rests upon us as parents. The secondary responsibility rests with the educational system and society as a whole.
And we have one last question and one last comment. The question's from Stephanie Van Hook, who asks, for me, I have to ask the question, what can we do? Most reporting doesn't address that. What questions do you ask yourself, Michael, when reading news that is both real and makes one despair? Sometimes it's not clear what we can do.
Yeah, that is a good question, and there's so much despairing news. What I do is, well, in my case, I have this mantra that I repeat, which is part of which is Gandhi's mantra, Rama Rama, and I hope I remember to say that for a few minutes before I do the reading, do the exposures to the mass media, and that gives me a kind of insulation, kind of inoculation, if you will, so that I remember 2 things. These people are describing only the outside world, and they're describing it through the mirror of the old paradigm, where negativity is truth. And I want to take in the facts without taking in the message that those facts are hiding but conveying. I know I saw a TED talk recently where a woman was a sociologist, and her mentor in sociology told her, if something cannot be measured, it doesn't exist. Now the word Maya in Sanskrit, which we sometimes translate as illusory appearance, comes from a root ma, meaning to measure. So the truth is that if you can measure something, it doesn't exist. Reality cannot be measured. So this is what I try to do, is that through meditation, through using the mantra, I remind myself of the inner world, which can never be destroyed. And then I can take in elements of the outer world, which is always being destroyed. And then more importantly, this is what happens when I engage in an interaction. I could be in an interaction with a very angry person. And in the old days, before I had this practice, the anger would be all that I saw. I would be like a mini newspaper reading that person. But now, by reminding myself, by concentrating, by calming down my own mind, I try to, and I usually succeed in being aware of the inner core of that person, which is immune to anger or alienation of any kind. So that's how I practice it in what I read. That's how I practice it in human interactions, which of course are more important. And I practice it, as I think you may be aware, Stephanie, and you also, Stephanie, I try to practice it in my work.
Absolutely. And the last comment from Sonia might be a nice place to end. She says, I can't believe I have had to live almost 39 years to discover a tangible explanation of wholeness. It's so exciting, and I find myself desperate to want to live as long as I possibly can to learn and share this whilst I'm still alive. I think many of us can relate to that excitement and enthusiasm that you shared, Sonia.
As they say in India, Chiran Jivatu, may you live a long, long time, for all that excitement and enthusiasm.
Well, I think we will go ahead and stop there since we've come up to an hour. We're getting many thank you comments in the Q&A box. And thank you, Michael, so much for taking some time today to talk with us and share your TED Talk live and in person for the certificate group. And I want to thank all of you for coming as well. Any final words, Michael?
Again, thanks everyone for giving me this opportunity and giving me this valuable feedback. And thank you, Stephanie, for keeping us all organized. And I hope this will be not the last, but the first of many conversations, and we will all stay in touch and have the great privilege of building this story and this shift together.
Absolutely. Well, until next time then, thank you, everyone.